Have you ever felt like you're trying your hardest to grow closer to God, but somehow He still feels far away? Maybe you've prayed, maybe you've read your Bible, maybe you've done everything that you know how to do, and yet you still find yourself wondering, am I growing? Am I getting this right? Why can't I tell the difference between my voice and God's voice? Why do I feel like I have to be a spiritual giant just to have a relationship with Him? And if you've ever felt that way, you're not alone. For years I thought that spiritual growth meant reaching for God. I thought if I prayed more, learned more, fixed more, became a better Christian, then eventually I would arrive. Eventually, I would be close enough to God. But then Jesus took me into a garden and showed me something that changed everything for me. He showed me that a seed doesn't grow by striving. It grows by receiving. Welcome to Bloom in the Sun. I'm Katie Armstrong. For years, I felt stuck in my relationship with God. I struggled to hear His voice, trust His plan, and discern what was really true. I wanted to follow Jesus, but I didn't know how to truly walk with Him. Everything changed when God began revealing Himself to me through my spiritual gifts. And by taking me as I am, He showed me how He is on my side and by my side. I discovered that relationship with God wasn't some religious formula to master. It was His daily invitation to dwell in His presence, remember His voice, and know Him for myself. Now, I'm on a mission to help believers encounter God for themselves, learn to walk confidently with Him, and step boldly into the purpose He created for them. Together, we're rescuing the lost, empowering and healing believers, and deploying God's army of disciples. Because the days ahead will require men and women who know God's voice for themselves, are confident in their spiritual gifts, and are fully prepared to carry His light into a world that desperately needs Him. So, sink into your pillows, reheat that lukewarm coffee, and bring your open mind. It's time to bloom in the sun. Hello lights! So I want to start this very first episode with the parable that shaped everything behind this podcast, and that is the parable of the sower. When Jesus first revealed this parable to me, I was in vision standing with Him in a really beautiful garden, and He told me that this is the place where it all begins. And there He began teaching me that parable of the sower. And this was at a time when, honestly, I really didn't know a whole lot about this parable, at least not in the way that He was showing it to me. And my relationship with God at the time, I would say, was quite rocky, to say the least. And so one day, I was in vision, I found myself with Jesus in this beautiful, lush green garden, and it was quite large and pretty much filled with every kind of plant that you could possibly imagine. And then Jesus invited me to a particular part of the garden where there was nothing but bare soil. So it was kind of just like a garden bed where you could grow crops. And then He knelt down and He invited me to join Him. And that was when He showed me all the things that I was already familiar with. I already knew that the soil represented my heart. And first, He pointed at this good, fertile soil, an open heart that's ready to receive what God wants to plant. Then He pointed to the thorny soil. A seed could take root there, but as it grew, the thorns would choke it before it could mature. Then next came the rocky soil. A seed could sprout, but because it couldn't grow deep roots, then it wouldn't survive. Then Jesus showed me, and it was so funny when He showed me this, but He showed me this gigantic rock where no seed could possibly reach the ground. And then Jesus said something to me that had actually never crossed my mind before. And He said this, He said, the soil represents your heart, and within your heart are all four soils. Because I feel like over the course of me learning this parable, we kind of try to narrow it down and be like, oh, well, which one am I? But I realized, no, oh my gosh, we actually have all four soils in our heart. And this is what Jesus was explaining to me. And so I knelt there beside him. I was very, very curious. And as he continued, he said to me, he said, there are things about God and his truth that you are completely open and ready to receive. But then there are also places where I've planted truth in your heart, but you've struggled to grow because it's surrounded by false beliefs that came from the teachings of men. Like you can feel the truth, but these other beliefs, these false traditions, choke that truth, choke that seed before it can fully take root. And then immediately I thought about all of these limiting beliefs that I actually carried about myself, about God, and also about what was actually possible. And then he pointed to the rocky soil. And this one really stood out to me. And this is what he said. He said, there are other places where truth lands in your heart, but because of pain, trauma, and the ways that you have learned to protect yourself, you've built walls. And a seed can land there, but it can't grow deep enough for transformation to happen. And it was then that I really was not looking at a garden anymore. I was looking at my heart through Jesus' eyes. Then we come to this rock. Now, when I say rock, I don't just mean rock, right? Like, this was a boulder. It was so enormous. And when Jesus was standing there and like looking at it, he had this grin on his face. And then he had like one eyebrow that was raised. And then he just like looked at me. And then I looked at him. And then he looked at the boulder and folded his arms. We both tilted our head to the side and he looked back at me. And I just completely lost it. I completely lost it laughing. Because it was kind of like that awkward laugh and awkward gaze where I'm just like, yep, there it is. The bane of my existence. And at this point, like, it wasn't even us talking, right? It was just us looking at each other and, like, both of us looking at this boulder in this, like, silent yet awkwardly hilarious conversation. And so he broke the silence first. And he was just calm. You know, he's calm about it with this slightly cheeky expression on his face. And that's when he said, so, what do you want to do with this? And I just stood there, like, shaking my head and shrugging my shoulders, half laughing and just, you know, half embarrassed, helpless, like, not really being able to find the words because I knew exactly what that rock represented. And on a serious note here, honestly, it was all the things that I felt were impossible. And it was all the things that I couldn't believe that God could change. It was the doubt, the unbelief, hopelessness, fear, guilt, shame, insecurity, like these lies that I had carried for so many years. And it was the things that felt so deeply rooted in me that I just assumed there was nothing I could do about them. They would always be there, and I just had to live with it, right? It was all these things I couldn't change. And then Jesus did the most funniest thing. He just like rolls up his sleeves, you know, and he's got this funny, exaggerated heaving sound. And he just like picks up this boulder like it was made of paper. Just picked it up. Just like that. Like it weighed absolutely nothing. And then he literally like throws it away. Kind of like on those cartoons where it just goes pew. And he just dusted off his hands and said, well, we won't be needing that anymore. And just walks off. And honestly, I'm just like standing there like, oh, what? And my jaw was dropped and just, I was completely flabbergasted. I really was. And anyway, so he like walks over to this watering can and brings it back to the little garden where we're standing. And he gets this seed out of his pocket and he puts it in the soil, covers it over, and then he gets this watering can and starts watering it. And as he was pouring the water over it, he said, "Healing your heart will take some time, but I am the gardener. And I promise you, Katie, that on your journey with me, I will make your heart whole again." And then he placed his hand on the soil where he had planted the seed and he just held it there. But what happened next, it wasn't in the soil. It happened inside of me. I felt his hand in my chest. And it was the deepest, most beautiful love that I've ever experienced. And in that moment, it felt so clear. It was like every fear, every confusion, frustration, questions about whether or not I could hear God, whether I was enough, like all of these struggles were just gathered into this one moment. And it was like it was all answered without a single explanation. And I just knew, like, I didn't have to be stressed or afraid anymore. I could let it all go and everything was going to be okay. Jesus would take care of me and he would walk me through it, that I didn't have to do this alone. And when he said, "I am the gardener," I knew inside me exactly what he meant. That he was the one who would remove the boulders. All of those things that felt impossible. All of the things that hardened my heart and the things that stood between me and God. He was the one who would pull out the thorns, the pretending, the performing, the striving, the confusion, the false beliefs that had limited my ability to receive his truth and receive him. The things that were blocking me from actually hearing God's voice. And I didn't realize that I wasn't hearing God's voice completely clearly because I had these blocks on me. But that he was the one who was going to be healing all of these rocky places in my heart, the wounded places, the hidden places, the places that were just far too painful for me to face, and I didn't want to face them. It was all these places that I felt were just too scarred to touch. It was all of these places that I had spent years protecting. After bawling my eyes out for probably an hour, Jesus continued to teach me. And he had another seed in his hand, and he said, "Now imagine you are this seed." And he gently placed it into the soil. And then he said, "The soil now represents God's heart, and you are planted in it." And then I watched as he covered the seed, and he said, "Before you ever see anything above the surface, there is growth happening beneath the ground. The seed grows roots in the darkness, downward, before it can grow upward." And I just sat there quietly, taking it all in. And then he asked me a question. He said, "Katie, can a seed grow itself?" And I shook my head and I was like, "No." And then he smiled and he said, "Exactly, because it's a seed. A seed cannot water itself. It cannot give itself sunlight. It is completely dependent upon its environment and what that environment provides." And then he placed his hand on my shoulder and he looked at me straight in my eyes. And he said, "You cannot grow all by yourself, Katie." And when he said that, looking at me, those words hit me harder than I can explain. Because I had spent so much of my life trying to grow, trying to be good enough, trying to do everything right, trying to get closer to God, like trying to heal and fix myself, all these other things, right? Change my habits, self-improvement, all these things. But then he pointed back to the seed. And then he said, all a seed can do if it wants to grow is surrender to what has been provided and receive it. And at that moment, I knew that he really wasn't talking about the seed, right? He was talking about me. Jesus was teaching me that growth happens when you become dependent upon God's heart, God's environment, and God's provision. A seed doesn't strive. A seed doesn't perform. A seed doesn't conform to the ideas of man. And a seed doesn't earn growth. It simply receives what has already been provided by God. So for most of my life, I thought that spiritual growth meant growing closer, right? Reaching for God. And I thought that if I had done all of this doo-doo, I like to call it, right? Praying enough, learning enough, reading my scriptures, serving, healing, believing, all of these things, then I would eventually arrive. I would eventually be close enough to God to encounter Him or to be worthy to be in His presence. And eventually I would become the kind of person that God could use, the kind of person who could really know Him, right? And walk with Him, see His face, all of these other things. But Jesus showed me something completely different. He said, Katie, look around you. And I looked at the garden. I looked at the soil. I looked at the seed. And that's when He said, you're not growing toward God. You're planted in Him. He's all around you. He is the soil that holds you and nourishes you. He provides the water so you can expand. He provides the air so you can live. He provides the light that grows you, that sustains you. And then He said something I'll never forget. He said, it's not you that grows to reach God. It's God that reaches you. And as a natural result of you receiving Him and what He has to give, that you grow. And what determines whether or not you grow is your willingness to receive what God provides. And for the first time in my life, I realized that growth wasn't the result of my ability to perform. It was the result of my willingness to surrender. My job wasn't to become my own gardener. My job was to trust the one who already was. So maybe you're listening today and you feel like you've been trying to, right? Trying to be that better Christian, trying to hear God, trying to heal, grow, get it all right, whatever. And maybe you are exhausted, just like I was, from carrying that responsibility that was actually never yours. And if there's one thing that I hope that you take away from this episode today, it's this. You don't have to grow yourself. You don't have to become your own gardener. You don't have to earn God's presence. You are already planted in His heart. And His presence is where your journey starts. And maybe today, instead of trying harder and doing more doo-doo, the invitation is simply to receive, to trust the gardener and allow Him to do only what He can do. Thank you for joining me for this first episode of Bloom in the Sun. Next time, we're going to be going back to the garden because while Jesus was teaching me about the seed, there was still one more thing that He had to teach me about: the growth of the sunflower and what it means to keep our hearts turned towards the light. So until next time, remember, you are deeply loved, completely held, and never growing alone.